We're going to look at notes 1-4. We're going to look at properties of real numbers, and we're going to look at 5 different properties real quick, and that's all for this lesson. So with that being said, let's start with the commutative property, and we can do this with addition and with multiplication. So an example of the commutative property is order doesn't matter. So if I take 10 plus 11, that is the exact same thing as taking 11 plus 10. The order doesn't matter. Okay? The next thing we want to look at is it also doesn't matter for multiplication. So if I'm going to multiply, let's just say 2 times 3. It doesn't matter if it's 2 times 3 or if we do 3 times 2. We get the same answer. That's the commutative property of addition and multiplication. Let's talk about the associative property next. The associative property is where you have parentheses. So if I were to have 1 plus 2 plus 3, I can have the associative property, meaning I can have parentheses and do the 1 plus 2 first. But I also can do the 2 plus 3 first and put parentheses around it first. So the associative property of addition and multiplication is where the grouping symbol can be around any of those numbers first. And so it works the exact same way if we were to be multiplying. 1 times 2 times 3, we could group the 1 and the 2 first, or we would get the same answer if we group the 2 and the 3 first. So associative property of addition and multiplication. The identity property of addition and multiplication. For this one, it keeps the identity of the original number. So 5 plus what is going to keep its identity 5? Well, we know 5 plus 0 will keep its identity. So if we add 0 to anything, it stays that number. And we also know that if we were to take 5 times and give me a number that we could multiply 5 by to get 5, we know that it keeps its value, it keeps its identity if we multiply by the number 1. So that is the identity property where the number keeps its identity. If we add 0 and it keeps its identity. And if we multiply by 1 to keep our identity. Let's talk about the 0 property of multiplication. And this one just states that 0 times any number, it doesn't matter what it is. You pick 75, 100, negative 230, I don't care what number, is going to keep the number 0. 0 times anything is 0. And last but not least, we kind of want to talk about the multiplication property of negative 1 and what happens with it. And so if we look at negative 1 and we times it by a positive number, let's say 8, then we actually get a negative 8. We get the opposite of its value. So negative 1 times a positive is going to give you that negative number. And then we know if we take our negative 1 times a negative, let's do negative 8, then we know the negative times a negative is going to turn that into a positive. So whenever you multiply by a negative 1, your sign is going to be opposite. So your value is going to be the opposite sign. I want to talk about one more thing here. And with that being, we know, and I hope we know, that any number divided by itself is 1. So if I have 16 divided by 16, that is 1 whole. If we have 7 divided by 7, that is 1 whole. If I have a negative 5 divided by negative 5, that is also 1 whole. And I want you to also know that that includes letters. So if I had an A divided by A, that is 1 whole. Anything divided by itself is 1. And the very last thing I want to stress, because we sometimes get confused with this, if I have a fraction, I want to make sure we understand that if we have a negative 1/2, the negative sign can be in the numerator. But it is also equal to if I have the negative sign right in front of the fraction, almost in line with the fraction bar itself. And it is also the same thing as if the negative sign was in the denominator. All of these mean negative 1/2. I know there are 3 different ways of looking at it, and they all mean the same thing. So if you ever see the problem, just my opinion, like one of these 2 ways, I automatically just put the negative symbol in the numerator because I just think it's easier to deal with. But they all 3 are equal in value, meaning the exact same thing. And the same is true that if I have a positive 1/2, we know that a negative 1 divided by a negative 2, a negative divided by a negative is a positive. So if you ever see a negative and a negative, then you really are just dealing with 1/2, positive fraction, positive number. That's all I've got. Short notes today.